Rain poured down in sheets as Rebecca Chen hurried from the subway station toward her apartment building, her thin jacket offering little protection against the November downpour. At 26, Rebecca had the exhausted, determined look of someone barely staying afloat in New York City. Her small frame was hunched against the wind, her long black hair plastered to her face, despite the futile protection of her hood. The weight of the day, 10 hours at the publishing house where she worked as an editorial assistant followed by 3 hours waiting tables at a nearby diner, clung to her like the rain-soaked clothes against her skin. The city had not been kind to Rebecca since she'd arrived 4 years earlier, armed with an English literature degree, a handful of short stories published in literary journals, and dreams as tall as the Manhattan skyline. The reality had proven harsher than her imagination. Entry-level publishing paid barely enough to cover half her rent, the literary world seemed impenetrable despite her talent, and the stack of rejection letters for her novel manuscript grew taller each month. The waitressing job had started as a temporary measure, but had become a fixture in her life, the tips essential for survival. Just 2 more blocks, she thought, shifting her bag to protect the dog-eared manuscript she'd been editing during her subway ride. Hot shower, cup of tea, maybe an hour of writing before bed. The apartment she shared with 2 roommates was small and overpriced, but tonight it represented warmth and shelter, 2 commodities that seemed increasingly precious as the temperature dropped and her boots filled with icy water. Rebecca was so focused on reaching her destination that she almost missed the huddled figure in the recessed doorway of an abandoned storefront. Something made her slow her steps, perhaps a movement, or the realization that the shape was too large to be discarded trash. When a flash of lightning briefly illuminated the scene, she saw him clearly. A man, middle-aged perhaps, though it was hard to tell. He was wrapped in what appeared to be a tattered coat and a plastic tarp, his belongings gathered close in a weather-beaten backpack. What struck Rebecca most wasn't his obvious homelessness, but the dignity with which he sat, straight-backed despite his circumstances, a small cardboard sign propped against his knees. The rain had begun to dissolve the marker ink, but the words were still legible. Veteran. Anything helps. God bless. Rebecca hesitated. She had passed countless homeless individuals during her years in the city, sometimes offering spare change, more often averting her eyes with the guilt-tinged self-protection that urban life seemed to demand. But something about this man, perhaps the military posture that persisted despite his circumstances, or the quiet resignation in his expression, made her pause. The man didn't call out to her or extend a cup. He simply met her gaze with eyes that were clear and startlingly blue against his weathered face. There was no desperation in his look, just a quiet acknowledgement of one human being to another. "Pretty bad night to be outside," Rebecca said, immediately feeling foolish for stating the obvious. "Been through worse," the man replied, his voice deeper and more articulate than she had expected, though not by much. A hint of a smile crossed his face, and Rebecca found herself smiling back despite the absurdity of the exchange. 2 strangers, connecting briefly in a downpour, one with a home to go to, one without. "Do you have somewhere to go tonight?" she asked. "A shelter or something?" The man shook his head slightly. "Shelters fill up early on nights like this. I'll be all right, though. Got my tarp." He patted the plastic sheet that was doing a poor job of keeping him dry. Rebecca shifted uncomfortably, rainwater running down her neck and beneath her collar. She should continue on. Her roommates would be wondering where she was, and she had an early start tomorrow. But the thought of retreating to her warm apartment while this man remained in the doorway seemed suddenly unbearable. She reached for her wallet, mentally calculating what she could spare. The truth was she couldn't spare anything. Her bank account held exactly $23.14, which needed to last until her next paycheck in 3 days. 20 of those dollars were earmarked for groceries. The remaining $3 and change wouldn't make a difference to either of them. Yet something compelled her to pull out the $20 bill, her grocery money, her meal ticket for the next 3 days. "Here," she said, extending the bill toward him. "There's a 24-hour diner around the corner on 9th. The food's not great, but it's warm inside, and they don't hassle people too much if you nurse a cup of coffee for a while." The man looked at the money, then back at Rebecca's face, his expression unreadable. You sure you can spare that? I'm not asking for your last dollar." Rebecca almost laughed at how close to the truth he was. "I'm sure," she lied. "Please take it." After a moment's hesitation, he reached out and accepted the bill, his fingers calloused and cold against hers. "Thank you," he said simply. "My name's David, by the way. David Reeves." "Rebecca Chen," she replied, surprised by the formality of the introduction. "Stay dry if you can, David." As she turned to leave, he called after her, "Miss Chen, your kindness won't be forgotten." The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard, and she managed a small wave before continuing her journey home, already wondering how she would stretch her remaining $3.14 across 3 days. The next morning, Rebecca woke to find her roommate Jen had made a large pot of pasta the night before and left a note inviting everyone to share. It wasn't the breakfast Rebecca would have chosen, but it was food that didn't cost her anything, and for that she was grateful. The following days were lean but manageable. The diner where she waitressed provided a free meal per shift, and her other roommate had baked cookies for an office party that had been canceled, resulting in an unexpected windfall of sweets. By the time her paycheck arrived, Rebecca had almost forgotten about the $20 and the homeless veteran. Almost, but not quite. On particularly cold nights that winter, she found herself wondering if David had found shelter, if the money had provided him with a few hours of warmth and food, if he was still out there somewhere in the vast, indifferent city. Life continued its relentless pace. Months passed, then years. Rebecca's novel was finally accepted by a small publishing house. Not enough to quit her day job, but enough to validate her dreams. She was promoted at work, moved to a slightly less cramped apartment, and gradually built a modest reputation as a promising literary voice. The constant hustle of survival became less all-consuming, though never truly absent. 5 years after that rainy November night, Rebecca sat in a small, sunlit office at Harper Publishing, where she now worked as an acquisitions editor. At 31, she had gained confidence along with experience. Her dark hair was now styled in a professional bob, her wardrobe had upgraded from thrift shop finds to modest but respectable office attire, and she had published 2 novels to critical, if not commercial, acclaim. She was reviewing a manuscript when her assistant buzzed her intercom. "Rebecca, there's a David Reeves here to see you. He doesn't have an appointment, but he's very insistent." Rebecca frowned, the name stirring a distant memory she couldn't quite place. "David Reeves, did he say what company he's with?" "He said you helped him once, and he's here to return the favor. Should I tell him you're busy?" Curiosity piqued, Rebecca set aside the manuscript. "No, it's fine, send him in." She stood as the office door opened, expecting perhaps a former colleague or industry contact whose name she'd forgotten. Instead, a tall, well-dressed man in his late 50s entered the room, his bearing military, straight, his blue eyes startlingly familiar, despite the context being all wrong. "Ms. Chen," he said, his deep voice triggering the memory that had eluded her. "Though I suppose it's Ms. Chen now, given your success?" Rebecca stared, recognition dawning slowly. "David? From the doorway? During the rainstorm?" He smiled, the expression transforming his now clean-shaven face. "You remember. I wasn't sure you would." "Of course I remember," she said, gesturing for him to take a seat as she sank back into her own chair, still processing the transformation before her. Gone was the homeless veteran in tattered clothes. In his place stood a man in an impeccably tailored suit, leather briefcase in hand, the picture of corporate success. "You look different," she managed, immediately regretting the inadequacy of the observation. David chuckled. "I should hope so. It's been a long journey back from where I was when we met." "What happened?" Rebecca asked, unable to contain her curiosity. "How did you—" She gestured vaguely at his apparent prosperity. "Find my way off the streets," he finished for her. "It's a long story, but the short version is that your $20 did more than buy me a meal that night. It reminded me that kindness still existed when I'd nearly lost faith in humanity." He placed his briefcase on her desk and opened it, removing a manila folder. "But I didn't come here to reminisce. I came because I've been following your career, Ms. Chen. Your novels, your work in publishing. You're talented. More talented than your current position suggests. Rebecca blinked in surprise. You've read my books? Both of them. Twice. He handed her the folder. I also read your first unpublished manuscript, the one that collected all those rejections before your breakthrough. You left a copy at that diner on 9th Street one night. The manager found it and gave it to me when I returned looking for you a few weeks after our encounter. Stunned, Rebecca opened the folder to find a printout of her earliest novel, the one that had never found a publisher despite coming close several times. The manuscript was annotated with notes and comments, the pages well worn from repeated reading. I don't understand, she said, looking up from the pages. You kept this? All these years? David nodded. It got me through some dark times. Your words, they mattered. They still do. He leaned forward slightly. Which brings me to why I'm here. I'd like to make you an offer. An offer? Rebecca echoed, feeling increasingly disoriented by this unexpected reunion. I'm the founder and CEO of Reeves Media Group, he explained. We own 23 regional newspapers, 15 digital media outlets, and, as of last year, Horizons Publishing House. Rebecca's eyes widened. Horizons was one of the most prestigious independent publishers in the country, known for taking risks on literary fiction that larger houses wouldn't touch. Horizons is looking for a new editor-in-chief, David continued. Someone with vision, literary taste, and a personal understanding of both the creative and business sides of publishing. I believe you're that person. But I'm nowhere near qualified for that position, Rebecca protested, her mind reeling. I've only been an acquisitions editor for 2 years. There are dozens of more experienced candidates. Experience isn't everything, David countered. Sometimes fresh perspective is more valuable. Besides, I've done my research. Your colleagues respect you. Authors love working with you. The 2 books you championed last year both won major awards. He paused, studying her shocked expression. Of course, I wouldn't expect an immediate answer. The compensation package is outlined in the folder, along with the job description. Take some time to think about it. Rebecca glanced down at the folder again, noticing for the first time the Horizons Publishing logo embossed on its cover. This is overwhelming, she admitted, and slightly unbelievable. Are you really offering me this position because I gave you $20 in a rainstorm 5 years ago? David's expression sobered. No, Ms. Chen. I'm offering you this position because you're the right person for it. But I might never have known you existed if not for that $20. And the kindness behind it. He rose to leave but paused at the door. There's one more thing you should know. That night we met, I was at my lowest point. A failed business, a divorce, PTSD from my military service that I refused to acknowledge or treat. I'd been on the streets for 8 months and had decided that night would be my last. I was going to wait out the storm and then end things. Rebecca felt her throat tighten as the implications of his words sank in. Your small act of generosity from someone who clearly couldn't afford it made me reconsider. Not immediately, but it was the first step. I went to the VA hospital the next day instead of following through with my plan. Got help, eventually reconnected with an old Army buddy who gave me a job in his security firm, worked my way up, saved, invested shrewdly in some tech startups, and the rest followed. He smiled again, the expression genuine but tinged with the memory of darker times. So no, this job offer isn't because of $20, but my being alive to make it? That very well might be. With that, he handed her his business card, embossed, heavy stock with just his name and contact information, and left, the door closing softly behind him. Rebecca sat motionless, staring at the folder, the manuscript, and the business card that represented a future she had never dared to imagine for herself. The salary listed in the compensation package was more than triple what she currently earned. The position would give her the influence to champion voices like her own, diverse, literary, important, but often overlooked. It was everything she had worked for, arriving from the most unexpected source imaginable. 3 weeks later, Rebecca stood in the lobby of the Horizons Publishing headquarters in downtown Manhattan, waiting for the elevator that would take her to her new office as editor-in-chief. The building was historic, with Art Deco details and marble floors polished to a mirror shine. A far cry from the cramped quarters at Harper, where editors shared offices and the air conditioning worked only sporadically. As she waited, a silver-haired man in an elegant overcoat approached, stopping beside her to wait for the same elevator. Rebecca recognized him immediately from industry events and news photos. William Hargrove, the literary giant whose novels had defined American fiction for the past 3 decades. "Good morning," she greeted him, trying to keep her voice professional despite her inner literary fangirl screaming in excitement. Hargrove nodded politely. "Morning. Are you new here? Don't believe we've met." "Rebecca Chen," she introduced herself, extending her hand. "I'm starting as editor-in-chief today." Recognition dawned in Hargrove's eyes as he shook her hand. "Ah, you're David's protégé. I should have guessed. He speaks very highly of you." Rebecca felt a flush of pleasure at the words, though protégé wasn't exactly accurate. "You know David well?" Hargrove chuckled as they stepped into the arriving elevator. "Known him since we were boys in Minnesota. We served together in Vietnam, if you can believe it. Lost touch for many years. My fault, not his. Let's say, I was too concerned with my own success to notice when a friend was struggling." The elevator began its ascent, and Hargrove continued. "David's quite a remarkable man. Built his media empire from nothing after hitting rock bottom. Not many people know he was homeless for a time." "Yes, he mentioned that," Rebecca said quietly. "Did he tell you about the young woman who saved his life? Gave him money for a meal when she clearly needed it herself?" Hargrove asked, his tone conversational but his gaze sharp. "He tells that story to everyone who works closely with him. Says it's a reminder that success isn't measured by what you accumulate, but by what you give when giving is difficult." The elevator chimed as they reached Rebecca's floor. "This is me," she said, holding the door. "It was an honor to meet you, Mr. Hargrove." "The honor is mine, Ms. Chen," he replied with a small, knowing smile. "David doesn't make decisions lightly, especially about who leads his flagship publishing house. I look forward to seeing where you take Horizons." As Rebecca stepped out of the elevator, Hargrove called after her. "Oh, and Miss Chen? I've read your novels. Remarkable work. We should discuss your next one over lunch sometime. I believe David mentioned you have an unpublished manuscript that deserves reconsideration." The elevator doors closed on his smiling face, leaving Rebecca standing in the reception area of what was now her publishing house, a strange sense of coming full circle washing over her. Later that day, as she settled into her spacious corner office with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, Rebecca found a small gift box on her desk. Inside was a beautifully bound edition of her first, never-published novel, the one she had accidentally left in the diner all those years ago. A note was tucked into the cover. "Some stories take longer to find their audience, but the ones worth telling always find their way home eventually. This one's publishing date is set for spring. Congratulations on your new position. David. P.S. The advance has been deposited to your account. I think you'll find $20 has an excellent return on investment these days." Rebecca opened the book to the dedication page, where a single line was printed in elegant typeface. "For the strangers who become saviors when we need them most, and for DR who reminded me that every act of kindness ripples outward in ways we can never foresee." Through the window she could see the vast cityscape of Manhattan, the same city that had once seemed so indifferent to her struggles, the same streets where a chance encounter in a rainstorm had set in motion events that neither she nor David could have possibly imagined. Somewhere out there, perhaps another young writer was giving away their last $20, or another person at their lowest point was finding the courage to seek help. The thought made Rebecca smile as she ran her fingers over the embossed cover of her book, tangible proof that sometimes, when kindness seems most foolish, it proves to be the wisest investment of all. 6 months later, Rebecca stood nervously in the wings of a small auditorium at the New York Public Library, listening as David Reeves addressed the gathered crowd of publishing professionals, literary critics, and readers who had come for the official launch of her newly published first novel, The Doorway. "Literature has always been a refuge for me," David was saying, his deep voice carrying easily through the room. "During my darkest times, when I had nothing, I still had words, the ones I carried in my memory, and the ones I was fortunate enough to find, including a remarkable manuscript left behind in a diner by a young writer who had no idea her words would help save a life." Rebecca watched as he held up a copy of her book, no longer a dog-eared manuscript, but a beautifully designed hardcover that had already received glowing reviews in publications from the New York Times to the New Yorker. "Today I'm proud to introduce that writer, whose work has finally found the audience it deserves. But more importantly, I'm honored to call her a friend and colleague whose single act of kindness years ago set in motion a series of events that neither of us could have predicted." He turned toward the wings, extending his hand in invitation. "Please welcome Rebecca Chen, author of The Doorway and the new editor-in-chief of Horizons Publishing." As Rebecca stepped onto the stage to warm applause, she caught sight of her roommates from those early struggling days, seated in the front row beside her parents who had flown in from California for the occasion. Jen was wiping away tears while giving an enthusiastic thumbs up. The journey from that rainy night to this moment seemed simultaneously impossible and inevitable, a story she could never have written, but was somehow always meant to live. Taking her place at the podium, Rebecca looked out at the audience, then at David, who had moved to the side of the stage, his expression a mixture of pride and something deeper, the unspoken understanding between two people whose lives had intersected at precisely the right moment. "Thank you all for coming," she began. "Writers are often told to write what they know, but sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones we live without realizing their significance until much later. The Doorway began as a novel about missed connections and second chances, written by a young woman who was barely staying afloat in this beautiful, brutal city." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "What I didn't understand then, what I'm only beginning to understand now, is that the line between giving and receiving is often blurrier than we imagine. 5 years ago, I gave $20 to a stranger during a rainstorm. It was my grocery money for 3 days, and at the time it felt like a foolish impulse. Today, I stand before you as living proof that kindness is never wasted, even when, especially when, it seems like more than we can afford." As the evening continued, with readings and a reception where Rebecca signed books until her hand cramped, she found herself returning to that moment in the rain, the simple human connection that had altered the trajectory of 2 lives. The $20 hadn't just helped David survive a night. It had reminded him that he was seen, that he mattered, and his reappearance in her life hadn't just advanced her career, it had shown her the immeasurable impact that small acts of compassion can have when given freely, without expectation of return. Years later, when Rebecca's memoir topped the bestseller lists and David's media empire had expanded to include film production and digital platforms, people would ask about the extraordinary circumstances that brought them together: the homeless veteran and the struggling writer, the lost manuscript and the second chances. They would smile at each other across interviewers' desks or auditorium stages, sharing the shorthand of old friends who had weathered much together, and Rebecca would often repeat the line that had become something of a personal motto: "The most powerful currency isn't measured in dollars, but in kindness freely given." And somewhere in the world, someone watching or reading their story would be inspired to extend their own hand when it seemed least practical but most necessary, continuing the ripple effect of that $20 bill given away on a rainy November night by a young woman who couldn't spare it, but gave it anyway. True wealth multiplies when shared,